Now, responding to Dr. Hayashi's introduction and the issue and agenda setting, we'd like to proceed with the following part of the seminar. And first, I would like to introduce Professor Hugo, and he's going to speak on key trends in international migration and their relevance for Japan. Professor Hugo is from the University of Adelaide, Australia.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for the great honour of talking to this very important seminar. I must say that I was really very honoured to get this invitation. I first came to Japan in 1971, and at that time it was a 10-yearly meeting of ESCAP, the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Every 10 years they have a meeting to look at the big population issues which face Asia and the Pacific. And at that meeting in 1971, international migration was not mentioned one single time in the whole conference. And yet in the most recent ESCAP conference, international migration was far and away the most significant and important population issue which was discussed. And I think, to me, that indicates the massive significance of this change in the significance of international migration globally. And I think it's very important to realise that international migration now is not, it can't be seen as a short-term gap strategy in order to meet labour shortage. International migration today is a structural feature of global economies. It's a fundamental feature of globalising economies, and accommodation of migration into national systems is really crucial. And I believe that, and I'm not going to talk about Japan today, but I think that Japan has a huge opportunity to develop its own migration model, which draws on its own traditions, which draws on its own strengths, but also can look at what has happened in other parts of the world and take from it the experience which can benefit Japan. And I see a quite significant opportunity into the future for Japan in migration. And that's why I was really very pleased to see this conference today, because I think it is very timely. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about what I think are some of the major global developments in migration, but I'm also going to focus on my own country, Australia, because Australia is known as a country of immigration, but I don't think many people would realise that when I was first born, Australia was a very homogeneous country. Virtually the whole population was of Anglo-Celtic origin. We're basically from England. So within one generation, Australia has transformed from being almost monocultural to being very multicultural. And I think there are some real lessons in that for other countries. So I'll say a little bit about Australia as well. Now, in my presentation, there is many slides and much information. In order to get through it in the time provided, I will skip some sections, but the slides are made available, and also I'm writing a paper based on the presentation. Migration is easily the most volatile element in population dynamics. It can move and change very quickly. But it's also that part of the population which is most influenced by policy. And so it has enormous potential, I think, to deal with issues such as ageing and the economy. The key thing about migration, though, is that it is a very complex phenomenon, and its relationship with economic change and with demographic change is a very complex, multi-directional relationship. And I think too often we tend to simplify those relationships. I first carried out research in Asia looking at population mobility in villages in West Java, and I've been going back to those same villages for the last 40 years. And one thing which has struck me is the enormous increase in personal mobility. One of the big changes of the last few decades is that migration now is within the calculus of choice of nearly everybody in Asia. Even though it might be internal migration, but migration is now possible for the bulk of the world's citizens. I think when we're looking at migration, there's a tendency to think of it in terms of dichotomies, in terms of categories. And one of the things which I think is very important to recognise is that those categories aren't sharp dichotomies. In fact, there is gradations between these different elements. So internal and international migration is seen as one of the greatest distinctions which we can make in migration, but they are very linked, as we heard in the last presentation, of the fact that migrants, overseas migrants, do tend to be very spatially concentrated within countries, and that's certainly the case in Australia. Permanent versus temporary, they tend to be strongly dichotomised, but in fact there tends to be different gradations between permanent and temporary. Forced and voluntary, documented and undocumented, economic and non-economic migration, and high skill versus low skill. I just want to, before I look at the global trends, point out what I think are some of the really key issues which are being discussed in relation to migration globally. And probably the most significant is migration and economic development. It's being realised that migration can be an enabler, it can facilitate, it can assist development, not just in destination countries, but in origin countries as well. And as we're coming to understand the complexity of that relationship, we're realising that migration policy can have very important economic outcomes. And this is where I think in the Japan situation that there is considerable potential. There's also an increasing realisation that environmental change can facilitate migration, and particularly in relation to climate change. There's a very substantial discourse now on the potential relationship between future climate change impacts and mobility. We've already heard the term replacement migration, the extent to which in an ageing society migration can replace older populations with working populations. My belief is that the original concept of replacement migration is a very simplistic one, that you just replace older people with younger people. I think we can develop more sophisticated and nuanced interpretations of replacement migration, so it may not be a simple demographic replacement, but actually focus migration on particular areas, skilled migrants or carer migrants needed for older population and so on. And so I think in looking at Japan's future migration, replacement migration has a role, but I think we need to rethink what we mean by it. Migration and skill. Skilled populations are very mobile, and even in my own country recently, I calculated that 56% of the population with a higher degree in Australia is a migrant. And what we tend to find is that skill formation in countries is increasingly relying not just on human capital development within the country, but also being able to attract skilled people from the outside. And of course, forced migration, refugees and asylum seekers, is very important. There are significant differences in countries between the acceptance of migration, and that is something which we can see quite dramatically in the difference between Japan and Australia, for example, where attitudes towards migration are quite different. Now, if we look at the global migration figures, just recently the United Nations released its most recent estimate of global international migration, and you can see that it has increased to 232 million people living outside of their country of birth. If we look at the countries that they are living in, this map shows the very strong concentration in Europe and in North America, but also it's starting to show some significant destinations in Asia. And in fact, I think one of the most striking trends in the most recent United Nations data is that Asia soon will be the most significant destination of migrants. It's always been a major origin of migrants, but it is increasingly becoming a significant destination. And countries like Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan and so on are becoming much more significant destinations. If we look at the origins of migrants, the origins very much more are in South America, Africa and Asia. So that point which I made earlier, that Asia is increasingly becoming a very important destination as well as an origin of migrants, is a very important one. The other interesting trend from the most recent United Nations estimate is that so-called south-to-south migration is increasing in significance, and in fact there is now more south-to-south migration than there is south-to-north migration, which has previously been considered to be the most dominant flow towards OECD countries. So it's that growth in south-to-south migration which has been quite dominant. Another interesting development in the most recent statistics relates to policy. What we're seeing is a increasing proportion of countries are either leaving their immigration policies as they are or enhancing them, increasing them. A smaller proportion of countries than ever before in the United Nations statistics is actually trying to reduce the amount of migration. Whereas in the past, policies to reduce migration were dominant, they are much less dominant among global countries now than they were previously. Not only that, there has been a very significant increase in the number of countries which have definite policies to attract skilled migrants. And it is, I think, interesting that many countries in Asia now are looking at the Australian model of skilled migration, and I think particularly of China. I've been asked to go to China to help them develop a skilled migration policy so that they can attract skilled migrants in the same way that Australia is able to. So more and more countries are realising that they need to enhance the skill base of their population through migration. And it's not just the highest income countries which are doing that. We look at the situation in the OECD countries, and the two crosses I've given here relate to Japan, which is on the left-hand side, and Australia on the right-hand side, just to give the contrast in terms of the level of permanent inflows of migrants, which are different between the two countries. If we look at population growth, Australia again is one of the fastest growing countries in the OECD, with its current growth rate about 1.8% per annum, half of which is net migration and half of which is natural increase, because the fertility levels still remain fairly high in Japan, in Australia. I was going to say a little bit about internal migration, but I think I will skip that. But just to mention that I think we can often neglect internal migration when in fact the numbers are very, very large. The most recent United Nations compilation of statistics indicate that about 800 million people have been identified as living outside of their region of birth. Let's move on and try and characterise the existing international global migration regime. I've just listed what I think are some of the most significant elements in that regime. The first is the overall increase in mobility. With each year that goes past, a bigger proportion of people are living outside of their country. And whereas in the past, in the early post-war years, there were only a very small number of countries involved, and we talk about the traditional migration countries of Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States. But now every country in the world has significant migration either in or out. And perhaps most significantly of all, temporary migration is becoming the dominant paradigm over permanent migration. In the past, permanent resettlement has been dominant, but that increasingly a large number of different types of non-permanent mobility are becoming significant. Another dimension, which is recognised by my colleague Stephen Castles, is what he calls the bifurcation of immigration policies. In most countries, they welcome skilled migrants, while at the same time making it harder for unskilled migrants to enter. And yet we do realise that in many countries there are shortages of unskilled workers. And so one of the real challenges, I think, in developing the new global migration regime is to have opportunities for both skilled and unskilled migrants. Another aspect relates to the diaspora, or the group of people from a particular country who aren't living within their country. In my own country, in Australia, the last census showed that our population is 23 million, but there is 1 million Australians who live in other countries. So what is the population of Australia? Is it the population who are within the national boundaries on the night of the census? Or should we include those people who call themselves Australians but are living outside of the boundaries? And what we're realising is that the diaspora can play a very important developmental role in the origin countries. With modern forms of communication and travel, diaspora can remain heavily engaged in the economies of their origin countries. And so what we're finding is that half the countries in the world now have a definite policy to engage their diaspora in development at home. So that's another dimension of migration which is becoming much more significant. There are as many women migrants as men migrants, which is a significant change from the past. We know that there is increase in undocumented migration as well. And I think very importantly too, we've seen the development of a migration industry, or an industry which facilitates migration, particularly in Southeast Asia where I work. I think we need to reconceptualise international migration. In the past, we have simply seen it in terms of permanent displacement of people from one country to another. And this issue of transnationalism, which I think is becoming the dominant theory in migration, puts the stress not just on permanent displacement from one country to another, but recognises that migrants maintain significant linkages with their origin country. And so this concept focuses on circularity, or linkages and mobility between countries, rather than displacement of people from one country to another. And it's tied up also with the significance of diaspora. And it's really brought about a rethinking of the whole concept of brain drain. certainly migration can lead to a loss of highly skilled people from one country to another, and we see it particularly with doctors from African countries, for example, moving to Europe and to Australia. But there may well be policies which we can do which actually allow those doctors to continue to play a role in their origin country. For example, I've put up to the Australian government a suggestion that African doctors can have Australian citizenship and work in Australia, but also have the freedom to go back and work in their own country for periods of time without losing any seniority, without their children having to change schools or whatever. So thinking about how migration can benefit the origin country as well as the destination country is very important. The different types of international migration, I mentioned south-north migration is very significant, but more and more it's migration between south countries, which is important. Contract labour movement, student migration, refugees, and marriage migration, which we've heard about. Now, what's driving international migration? What are the causes of it? Well, the Global Commission on International Development, International Migration, suggested that the main cause of international migration was differences between countries in what they called the 3 Ds. Differences in development, in other words, economic differences. People will move from places of low opportunity to high opportunities. The second D is demography. They'll move from countries which have high growth rates to countries which have got low growth rates or population declines. And the third D relates to democracy, and that is that people will move away from oppressive regimes into more free areas. But there are some other things too, and particularly social networks. What we do know is that once networks are established, migration can become a system which operates in and of itself. And the significance of social networks is only, I think, just being recognised. The migration industry is important, and policy and environment as well. What we're seeing in the world these days is what has been referred to as talent wars. People with high skills are in very great demand, and the countries which are out there attempting to recruit them are increasing in number. I mentioned that China has very recently joined this group of countries who are competing for skilled migrants. Migration is becoming a major contributor towards the development of the national pool of human capital. We do know that differences in income between countries are widening rather than getting closer, and that is going to continue to drive migration. But demography is fundamental. This map is taken from, this diagram is taken from the World Bank, and on the left-hand side, what it shows is the number of people in the working age groups for all OECD countries. What that showed is that the numbers in those working age groups peaked in 2010. There is now, with each year, declining numbers of people aged 15 to 64 in high-income countries. By 2020, there will be 20 million less people aged 15 to 64 in OECD countries than there was in 2010. But look at the other graph. The other graph is low-income countries. And what that shows is that between 2010 and 2025, there will be an increase of 1 billion in the number of people aged between 15 and 64. So there is going to be a flow from the right-hand side to the left-hand side purely because of that demographic difference between them. It's not going to be the only factor involved, and we shouldn't slip into some sort of demographic determinism, but it is going to be a significant factor which is influencing migration into the future. And demographers talk about the demographic dividend. That's that advantage that economies gain by having a very high proportion of their population made up of young, working age population. And the significance of the demographic dividend, I think, is underlined by some recent work which was done on China. And what that showed was that between 1990 and 2010, 20% of China's economic growth was purely due to the demographic dividend, purely due to having a high proportion of its population made up of young working people. So that demographic factor is very, very important in development. Environment is significant, and the recent release of the IPCC report indicates that migration is going to be one of the significant impacts of climate change, but the projections of these impacts, I believe, are somewhat exaggerated. And in fact, while there will be some displacement of population due to climate change, I think most of it is going to be occurring within countries. But there is going to be a relationship between migration and climate change, and we do need to understand it more. I'll just move on, and I did want to get on to talking about Australia. Now, Australia is seen as being a migration country. What this graph shows for the last 120 years in Australia is the contribution of natural increase, or births minus deaths, which is the lower part of the diagram, and the upper part of the diagram shows net migration. And what I want to point out is the significance of the post-war period. If you look at the period prior to World War II, there were periods of some migration, net migration, but it's really been since World War II that migration has been most significant in Australia's population growth. And not only has it been more significant in the growth of the population, for the first time it has involved people coming from non-English backgrounds. So it's been, it has transformed Australia from being a monocultural society in the late 1940s to one of the most multicultural societies in the world today. Currently, a half of Australia's population are a migrant or the child of a migrant. Now that is a very, very high level. It's a country of 23 million people, but as you can see, almost half the population are a first or a second generation migrant. In fact, if we had not had post-war migration, Australia's population would be about 13 million today rather than the 23 million which it is. But it's not just numbers which are important. What I've shown here is some of the figures from the 2011 census which indicate the degree of multiculturalism in the country. And what this shows is that a quarter of the population are now either born in a non-English speaking country or their parents were born in a non-English speaking country. And 1 in 5 households in Australia now speak a language other than English at home. So, and this is all within one generation. We have seen this change from a relatively monocultural society to one which is multicultural. And this is where the migrants to Australia come from. And you can see that Europe is still quite significant, but Asia now is overwhelmingly the dominant origin of migrants, along with the Pacific and particularly New Zealand. I want to say a little bit about the dynamics of Australian migration, because I think some of the things which are happening in Australian migration may well have some resonance in Japan. One of the things which has changed quite dramatically is the increase in non-permanent migration. Traditionally, Australia's migration system has been overwhelmingly focused on permanent migration. And in fact, there was direct opposition to the whole idea of non-permanent migration. And yet, what's happened since 1990 has been the introduction of a number of categories of non-permanent migration. And what I would argue is that an effective migration system like the Australian one depends on having a number of different types of avenues of migration for different purposes, and not single or one or two categories, having a number of different channels for different purposes. And what in fact happens is that currently more than a third of migrants, actually a third of permanent settlers in Australia, are in fact temporary migrants who've come to Australia and stayed permanently. And I think working out transitions which allow people to come in temporarily, and when they're compatible with the country, when they're compatible with their employer, they learn the language, they adapt to the culture, then they make that transition into permanent settlement. And that linkage between temporary and permanent migration, I think, is a very, very important one from if Japan is considering having any expansion of migration. And I think the logical area to look at is with students, because if students come, learn the language and so on, in many ways they can become the best possible settlers, because they have Japanese qualifications and they know about Japanese society. Another factor in the Australian migration system, it has become very focused on skill. In fact, recently I had my students do an exercise on Australia's parliamentarians. We did an exercise where we calculated whether these parliamentarians would be able to come to Australia as migrants. So we applied the test which migrants have to do to them in terms of education and so on. And in fact, not one Australian parliamentarian would qualify to come to Australia as a skilled migrant, because the tests are so stringent. And another area which I think may be of interest in Japan is that in Australia now, 1/4 of all migrants who are accepted for permanent settlement are compelled to settle outside of the major cities in the non-metropolitan areas. Now, those migrants get a discount on the points that they have to get in the migration points test. They get a discount if they're prepared to settle for at least 3 years in designated areas. And I think this is relevant when we're talking about the potential role for migrants in non-metropolitan areas. And it's very interesting that not just in Australia, but in North America and in Europe, there's been a significant shift in the ways in which migrants settle in these traditional migration countries. In the past, they've all settled in the major cities. They're now becoming very significant settlers outside of the capital cities in the areas which have suffered significant depopulation by the out-movement of younger people. And this use of migration as an instrument for the reinvigoration of non-metropolitan areas, I think is one of the key elements that does need to be considered. There's been increased diversity in Australia's migration system. One of the things which I think which has been successful in Australia is that the system has been gradual in terms of its introduction. In introducing new ethnic groups, new groups into Australia, it has been done in a very gradual way, beginning with Europeans in the 1950s and 60s, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, then some people from the Middle East, and then in the 70s we had groups from Asia, and more recently groups from Africa. It hasn't happened all of a sudden, it hasn't happened suddenly, but there's been a gradual increase in the diversity of intake, and I think that is really quite important in terms of getting public acceptance. I'll just skip over some of these. Very high level of education in migrants. This diagram shows different categories of migrants, and this point that I made earlier of having a large number of channels of movement into the country is important. This you can see here the top graph is skilled migration. In the past, family migration, refugees have been as large as skilled migration, but now skilled migration is far and away the biggest category. And the migration program has been linked much more closely to the economy in Australia. Temporary migration, the different types of temporary migration, students, skilled workers and working holiday makers, they've tended to increase. I just want to say a little bit of, this is a model of the Australian migration system with Asia, which I've developed. And because we have such good data in Australia, because it is an island country and we can control migration much more effectively, we can look at all of the flows. And what this shows is that there is much more return migration and circular migration than there is permanent displacement. And the system of migration between Australia and Asia should not be seen as a one-way flow of students and skilled migrants into the country. It's very much movements in both directions, and I think that I'm happy to answer any questions about that a bit later. I'll just move on because I know my time is nearly up. One of the recent pieces of modelling that we've done in Australia is to look at the net impact of different categories of migrants on the budget, on the national budget. And what this shows is really quite striking, that every single category of migrants eventually makes a positive contribution to fiscal impact in Australia. And that positive fiscal impact is almost immediate in the case of skilled migrants, but it takes much longer if you're looking at family and refugees and so on. But in terms of its net economic impact, it's quite substantial, and it's very clear that Australia's economic prosperity is very much tied to migration. There are, of course, societal issues. Increasing ethnic diversity does create issues. There are significant issues. But there is a positive attitude still towards migration. And we do have an official multiculturalism policy, the policy which ensures that people are able to follow their particular religious or national ways of life, so that that is enshrined in law. Despite that, though, we do get discrimination, and I think we still have got some way to go. There does tend to be relatively positive attitudes towards migration. They vary somewhat, and they're being tested at the moment in Australia, where the asylum seeker issue has been a very vexed one. But overall, there does tend to be more than half the population either are happy with the level of migration or are neutral relating to it. Okay, what's the future? And this is where I think there may well be some lessons for Japan. Migration is going to increase in scale and diversity in the global scene. It's very difficult to think of a scenario where it's going to get less because of those drivers which I was mentioning earlier. This presents significant opportunities for countries like Japan. Certainly for filling labour shortages, if those labour shortages exist, and one has to be fairly careful in terms of ensuring that there are shortages rather than employers simply wanting to create more competition to drive down conditions for workers. Migration can be of enormous advantage in enhancing the skill profile of countries. But one of the things that Australia is finding is that having very substantial linkages into other overseas countries, particularly in Asia, is an enormous economic advantage from the point of view of trade. It links Australia into those countries. So being part of a global economy can be facilitated by having a global population within your home country. There are certainly challenges in terms of management of migration, but also in maintaining social cohesion. The thing about it, though, is that policy is crucial. Policy is really fundamental in deciding whether migration is going to have a positive or a negative impact. And because migration can have both positive and negative effects. And the whole key is having policies which facilitate those positive impacts and minimise those negative ones. Governance is absolutely fundamental to the whole process. And what I believe we need globally is a transition away from a policing model, a model in which people try to stop migration or are draconian in their attitudes towards migration, but recognise that migration is important. Migration is here to stay. So let's have systems which manage that migration rather than focus on policing it. We don't have very good capacity in the migration area in terms of the infrastructure needed to manage migration and also in terms of the human resources, professionals in the migration area. We can't have effective migration policy unless we have a cadre of skilled migration professionals whose life is looking at migration. And I think one of the tasks which we have in the Asian region is to build up that group of people. I think too that we need to recognise the rights of migrants, but above all, for migration to be effective, I think we need a well-managed, multiple set of channels for mobility, which are linked to the opportunities which are available in that country of destination, with a mix of both permanent and temporary types of mobility, but with also the ability to move between temporary and permanent settlement. But we can't ever argue that migration in some way is a substitute for good economic policy. It can only ever be a policy which actually supports and assists good economic policy, good social policy, and good environmental policy. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.